Okay, so that's the title. There is no self-consciousness without inner sense. And I hope that at least some of you, when they hear the title, will be like, hey, wait a minute, isn't there transcendental apperception? So you might think that, and I call that the traditional view, there are two distinct kinds of self-consciousness in Kant. There is transcendental or pure apperception, the famous I think. And you might think transcendental apperception is a capacity that provides us with an awareness of ourselves as spontaneous thinkers or reasoners. And then on the other hand, there's inner sense, a perceptual capacity that provides us with an awareness of our maybe non-spontaneous inner states as appearances. You might also think that drawing this distinction is what makes Kant's view interesting from a systematic point of view. So people like Beatrice Longness or Matthew Boyle have argued that the distinction between two kinds of self-consciousness is important. It's somehow is an early version of views that you later on find in Wittgenstein, with this distinction between self-consciousness as a subject and an object. So you might think that this distinction explains the certain special attitude we have towards our own thinking, our own spontaneous mental activity. So our own spontaneous mental activity seems not to be such that we perceive it like our thoughts are not entities that somehow swim around in a mental pond and which we can observe. And the relation to our own thinking seems, again, to be spontaneous in a certain way that seems to conflict an, in a sense, model of an awareness of these thoughts. So if you perceive something, you're distanced from it, you're alienated from it in some sense, but our own thoughts aren't, they are our own making, so to speak. So how could, in a sense, play a role for the awareness that we have of them? There's a lot of textual evidence for the traditional view. So in the B edition, Kant criticizes other philosophers for treating inner sense as the same as the faculty of apperception, which he himself carefully distinguishes. He calls the I think the pure apperception in order to distinguish it from the empirical one. And he speaks of the consciousness of myself in the representation I. And he says that it is no intuition at all, but a merely intellectual representation of the self-activity of a thinking subject. Similar in the A edition, Kant distinguishes inner sense or empirical apperception, which, quote, can provide no standing or abiding self in the stream of inner appearances, from the pure, original, unchanging consciousness, namely transcendental apperception, which represents what should necessarily be represented as numerically identical. And he claims that all empirical consciousness has a necessary relation to a transcendental consciousness preceding all particular experience, namely the consciousness of myself as original apperception, which he calls the mere representation I. Now, I mean, that is overwhelming. There seems to be some difference between pure apperception and inner sense. So that nobody should deny that. What the textual evidence shows is this. So the faculty of pure apperception is distinct from the faculty of inner sense. So that's clear like daylight. And it also makes clear that the representation I that somehow is related or belongs to pure apperception is not an empirical representation. It is distinct from any empirical representation given by inner sense. You couldn't have abstracted it from something you observe in inner sense, etc. However, this alone does not show that there can be cases of self-consciousness that are an exercise only of the first faculty. So if you distinguish two faculties, they might work independently of one another, but maybe they also, another option would be that they can only work in combination with one another. And what the textual evidence also doesn't show is that the representation I, which results not from inner sense, but from another faculty, from pure apperception, could ever be part of an actual case of self-consciousness without being combined with representations originating from inner sense. So you might, as an analogy, think of the faculty of synthesizing sensible manifold. That is certainly distinct from the faculty of sensibility. So Kant thinks that the synthesis is never something that can come from sensibility. We need our own spontaneous activity there. But the faculty for sensible synthesis obviously cannot take place without any sensibility being given. So it could only operate together with another faculty. So in principle, there seem to be two options to account now for the relation between pure apperception and inner sense. There's strong independence, which somehow corresponds maybe to what I call the traditional view. And strong independence claims that the faculty of pure perception is independent from that of inner sense, in the sense that there are cases of actual awareness of one's own mental activities or states that are solely an exercise of the former without any contribution of the latter. So it's independent, pure perception is independent from inner sense in the sense that it can work without the latter. Weak independence, on the other hand, says something weaker. That's why it's called weak independence. So according to weak independence, the faculty of pure perception is also independent from that of inner sense, in the sense that it is irreducible to it and involves generally non-sensible content. So that is what is made clear by all the quotes. However, there are no cases of actual awareness of one's own mental activities or states that are solely an exercise of the former without any contribution of the latter. So weak independence says, well, we have this other faculty, but in order to have cases of actual self-consciousness, of an awareness of what we are thinking and doing and reasoning, whatever mental activity we ascribe to it, for any such awareness, we need both faculties, inner sense and also pure perception. So the uncontroversial part is that you need inner sense for some of your cases of self-consciousness, maybe the self-consciousness of yourself as someone having pain or seeing something, but weak independence says that's always the case. Even if you have an awareness of your own purely intellectual activity, like thinking or reasoning, you need inner sense. So why would you believe such a thing? Here is what I call the master argument for weak independence. And the master argument consists of three premises and a conclusion. That is, the conclusion will be a claim amounting to weak independence. And I think presenting the argument for weak independence in this way is good, because it makes clear which, if you want to deny weak independence, you have to deny one of the three following premises. First premise, when Kant speaks about self-consciousness, he means the awareness that we have of our own mental activities or states as our own. Or at least what I mean by self-consciousness here. So you might have other versions, ideas of what self-consciousness means, but I think what I mean in the Kantian sense by self-consciousness is an awareness that you have of your own mental activities. For example, the awareness you have of your own thinking. So an awareness of which strong independence would say you can have it without inner sense. Second, that's what I would call the Cartesian premise. For Kant, any awareness of our mental activities or states as our own implies an awareness of our own existence. So that's the cogito sum. If you're aware of your own thinking or whatever, then you can infer from that your existence, and you cannot somehow not fail to make that inference, because you see that you have to exist in order to think. And third, for Kant, any awareness of the existence of something implies intuition, which in the case of the awareness of our own existence must include intuition through inner sense. So since there's only sensible intuition, that intuition could only be sensible. If it's meant to be an awareness of our own mental life, it has to be inner sense. Okay. And from that, you can conclude that when Kant speaks about self-consciousness, he always means an awareness that includes intuition through inner sense. So let's go through these premises, and I'll present you alternatives to those premises, and maybe especially in the third case, textual evidence that prima facie seems to speak against it, but as I will argue, doesn't eventually speak against it. So Denying P, so here's an option, denying P1 impersonal self-consciousness. So P1 says when self-consciousness is, the Kantian self-consciousness is an awareness that we have of our mental activities or states as our own. So it's really an awareness of ourselves as ourselves, of our activity as our activity. Now, you might have read a recent, very interesting interpretation of Kant's transcendental apperception by Wolfgang Freitag and Katharina Kraus in their 2020 newspaper, an expressivist interpretation of Kant's I think. And I think they can be interpreted as denying that first premise. So the idea of the expressivist interpretation is that if you take a sentence, you can distinguish the semantic content of that sentence from the content that which this sentence expresses at a particular utterance of that sentence. So if you say, I think that it is raining, the semantic content is about yourself. It contains the representation I, whose semantic contribution is a particular person or thinker. But the expressivist says, well, the statement isn't really about yourself, it's about the weather. It's a way to express an attitude about the weather. So the expressed content just is about the weather. They use this idea of expressivism in order to describe what's going on in transcendental apperception. They think in empirical apperception, when innocence is involved, we have thoughts about ourselves, as ourselves. However, when the I think is used to express transcendental apperception, the semantic contents of the sentence I think P and the content expressed by the use of the sentence depart. I quote, while the first person pronoun in I think indeed semantically refers to the subject having the thought and the verb to the act of thinking, it does not identify this grammatical subject as an object of assertive predication in thought. So we don't, when we judge I think that P, we don't make a judgment about ourselves. What I think in fact expresses on such an occasion is not its semantic content, but the thought P itself, they say. And the fact, quote, that the representational content P is apprehended or represented in a single consciousness such that it provides objective content to thought. So when the I think is used to express transcendental apperception, it expresses a content that is not really about oneself and by which one does not represent one's mental activities or states as one's own. And I said, well, but Kant, when Kant speaks of self-consciousness, he means an awareness of ourselves as ourselves. So it's an I-directed, a self-directed content that we are grasping in transcendental apperception. But they deny that. So they deny premise P1. Now, I think although this reading is really original and interesting and a lot more would need to be said in order to refute it, I think there is prima facie really a problem about this view given, well, in the content of what I want to argue for here. I think it is pretty clear, and I will give you another argument for that, that transcendental apperception is a term of self-consciousness, and it's in general a bit unclear how expression of something, the expression of a thought or the expression of the unity of a thought relates to awareness or consciousness. So option one, about which you might take with respect to that relation between expression and self-consciousness, is that we can express things of which we are not conscious. So that would mean that in transcendental self-consciousness, we just express something, but we are not conscious of it at all. So this expression is not a case of self-consciousness. If you take that option, then actually their interpretation wouldn't conflict with my own, because I'm just saying what Kant means by self-consciousness. However, I think it's not really plausible, because it seems pretty clear that that apperception or self-consciousness, apperception is meant to be a term for self-consciousness. So if you assume that expression presupposes awareness of what is expressed, so you cannot express a certain content without being aware of it, it is unclear how we could express, I quote again, that the representational content is apprehended or represented in a single consciousness without representing this consciousness by means of the semantic content I. So you need to grasp the content of I in order to that this grasping is a case of an awareness of your own consciousness. Now, a second problem, so that, I mean, that objection is just, well, you guys are not talking about self-consciousness, come on. You're talking about something which seems interesting, maybe expressivism is an interesting view in the philosophy of language, but we Kantians, we want to know what self-consciousness is. Another more, I think, exegetical, even more serious idea is that there's one feature about transcendental apperception that Kant is particularly interested in, especially in the transcendental deduction, namely the awareness of the identity of the self or of oneself. So he says in A108 that transcendental apperception comes with an original and necessary consciousness of the identity of oneself. And he says famously, we are conscious a priori of the thoroughgoing identity of ourselves with regard to all representations that can ever belong to our cognition. Or I'm conscious of the identical self in regard to the manifold of the representations that are given to me in an intuition. And so if transcendental apperception is combined with an awareness of the identity of yourself, then how could transcendental apperception take place without the semantic content of I playing a role? Because by the semantic content of I, you are precisely representing that entity, the I, of whose identity you are transcendentally conscious. So it seems to be, to me, just simply, yeah, not intelligible how you could have this awareness of self-identity without the I playing another role than the expressivist says. So I think P1 seems pretty safe. P2 again also seems almost trivial. So you might think, how could anybody deny that you can be aware of your own thinking without being aware of your existence? Now, the problem with P2, or the prima facie problem with P2, is that Kant explicitly acknowledged that not every case of grasping the I think carries existential commitment or allows you to infer the I exist. Here's a passage which is truly relevant in this context. I cannot have the least representation of a thinking being through an external experience, but only through self-consciousness. Thus, such objects are nothing further than the transference of this consciousness of mine to other things, which can be represented as thinking beings only in this way. The proposition I think is, however, taken here only problematically, not insofar as it may contain a perception of an existence, the Cartesian cogito ergo sum, but only in its mere possibility, in order to see which properties might flow from so simple a proposition as this for its subject, whether or not such a thing might now exist. So here he seems to say that I can grasp the I think, I can take it problematically, and in this case, the I think doesn't contain the I exist. However, I don't think that this speaks against P2. P2 says that for Kant, any awareness of our mental activities or states as our own implies an awareness of our own existence. So what I want to argue is that taking the I think problematically is not a case of self-consciousness in this sense. It's not a case in which the I think expresses an awareness of our own mental activities or states as our own. So taking the I think problematically is grasping something about the I think, but not in a way that lets that I think be a case or constitute a case of self-consciousness. What you grasp in the very special case where you take the I think problematically is something what anybody who thinks I think grasps. So there seems to be something in common when you and I and whoever else thinks I think. there is some common form to all of that. These cases are cases of thought of the awareness of the thinking of very different thinkers. However, something is common in all cases, at least we all grasp the thought I think. In terms of contemporary philosophy of language, you might think what you're grasping here is something like a Kaplanian, David Kaplan's character, a character that then in a particular context takes or produces a certain content. So the contents of our thoughts differ, but we all grasp the same character if we think I think. And we can, so Kant speaks about the case where I'm trying to think of another being as a mental, as a thinking being. And he says, so I have to somehow put myself in this person's perspective or position. So, and then think what would they think when they thought I think. So I put myself in their position and look at the thought I think from their perspective. I cannot really be in their perspective, but I can see what would they think about them if they grasp the I think. Okay, that is, however, that operation exactly works. It might be different, there might be exegetical questions left there, but it's not a case of self-consciousness. That seems to be clear. Okay, so that isn't the counterexample to the otherwise very plausible premise P2. Now let's come to P3, and now we see that the textual situation is a bit more tricky here. So P3 says that an awareness of existence always is connected to sensible intuition. So you need an awareness, a sensible awareness of yourself in order to base your awareness of your own existence on it. Now, I first give you some I think rather overwhelming textual support for P3, and then we'll then come to a certain passage which I think constitutes the main obstacle in taking that textual evidence seriously. So in B416 to 20, Kant speaks about the methods of rational psychology as opposed to his own method. The method of rational psychology infers from the I think various determinations of thinking beings in general in their synthetic connection, without assuming from the start the existence of the concept of which is analyzed. So that is exactly the method of taking the I think problematically. You just take the thought I think, whoever, not your own thought, whoever is thinking it, and then try to infer from that how the thinking being is represented in that thought. And then you make the error of rational psychology of taking that way of representing yourself in this thought as at face value and inferring from that certain features of the self. However, his own analytic procedure is grounding on the I think given as a proposition that already includes existence in itself. It does not begin from the concept of a thinking being in general, but from actuality. And here apperception is something real. But because my existence is considered as given in the proposition I think, since it does not say that every thinking being exists, but only I exist thinking, that proposition is empirical. So Kant is very clear here, as soon as the self-consciousness, the I think, is about an actuality and something real, it is empirical. It implies, it is an empirical proposition. Now, later on in the rather famous footnote in B422, he writes the following: the I think is, as has already been said. So the as has already been said refers back to the passage I've just read out to you. It is an empirical proposition and contains the proposition I think, or is even identical with it. So here we have exactly the same claim as we had before. It's empirical because it implies an existence. And then he continues, it expresses an indeterminate empirical intuition, that is a perception. Hence, it proves that sensation, which consequently belongs to sensibility, grounds this existential proposition. So that seems to be the conclusion. So if it's about an existing, about a real actual thing, then it is empirical. And why it's empirical? Well, because it contains an empirical intuition, a perception, and it contains sensibility or sensation. This claim is also made in another passage from both editions. The I think expresses the perception of oneself, he says, and an inner perception. And then you might think in general, Kant's theory has a very strong commitment on assuming that existential claims can only be based on intuition. And he has a very strong commitment that this intuition in our case isn't intellectual, but sensible. So in the, here's a passage where he says, so however much our concept may contain, we have to get out beyond it in order to provide it with existence. This can only happen through the connection with some perception of mine in accordance with empirical laws, so that our consciousness of all existence belongs entirely and without exception to the unity of experience. And you find, so that's from the criticism of the ontological proof, but you find similar claims made in the postulates. And it's important to see that this claim is consistent with there being a severe distinction between pure apperception and inner sense. So claiming that the I think is an empirical proposition does not imply that pure apperception can be reduced to inner sense. So in B278, he says, the consciousness of myself and the representation I is no intuition at all, but a merely intellectual representation of the self-activity of the thinking subject. So here the I, the representation I, is called an intellectual representation. And he repeats that in the same footnote in which I've just mentioned from the B paralogisms. The I in this proposition is not an empirical representation, for it is rather purely intellectual because it belongs to thinking in general. So the sentence I think can be an empirical proposition without the representation I having to be an empirical representation. Why is it then still an empirical proposition? Well, without, he says, he continues, without empirical representation, which provides the material for thinking, the act, I think, would not take place. And the empirical is only the condition of application or use of a purely intellectual faculty. And that's, I mean, that's just what weak independence says. Pure apperception is distinct from inner sense, but it couldn't happen. It couldn't take place without inner sense playing also a certain role. Okay, so until now, everything seems fine, but then there is this one passage from the B deduction, the second part of the B deduction, which seems to point into a different direction. So I read it out for you. In the transcendental synthesis of the manifold of representations in general, hence in the synthetic original unity of apperception, I'm conscious of myself not as I appear to myself, nor as I am in myself, but only that I am. This representation is a thinking, not an intuiting. The I think expresses the act of determining my existence. The existence is thereby already given, but the way in which I am to determine it, that is, in which I am to posit in myself the manifold that belongs to it, is not yet thereby given. For that, self-intuition is required. So I think it is very natural or tempting, I should say, to read this passage in the following way. The claim that I'm conscious only that I am, this representation is a thinking, not an intuiting. You might read the second sentence here as saying that the whole consciousness that I am is a thinking without intuition. So my consciousness that I am is the consciousness of my own existence. And if you then say this representation is a thinking, not an intuiting, that just seems to be a claim that denies everything I've argued for so far, namely that it seems to deny that intuition is involved in my consciousness of my own existence. And when you read the end of that quote, when he says for that, namely for determining my existence, self-intuition is required, it's very tempting and at least not implausible at all to read that as meaning that self-intuition is required only for determining my existence, not for an awareness of that existence itself. So for the bare awareness of my own existence, you might think you don't need any self-intuition, only if you then start to try to find out anything more about you and get a determinate representation of yourself, some cognition of yourself, then you need self-intuition. So if you read this passage in this way, then, and I think it's some people who work on that, start from that passage and they say, well, there is this pure apperceptive awareness in Kant, sure, and he, in these passages, he also agrees that involves already an awareness of our own existence that is somehow pre-sensible. It's before any kind of sensible intuition takes place. It's a direct, mere intellectual, purely intellectual awareness of your own thinking activity. And here's the passage where Kant accepts that. As I've said, there are a lot of other texts where he explicitly denies that picture and says, no, it's an empirical proposition where whenever it involves the I exist, there needs to be sensation, it needs to be empirical. But here it seems as if he's saying something different. So we would have, if you read this passage in this way, we get a flat-out contradiction, textual contradiction, which might be what we have to accept. I mean, it's Immanuel Kant, but sometimes he might contradict himself. However, I think there is an alternative reading. So you, instead of taking this representation to refer to the whole awareness that I am, you might also take this representation to refer to the representation I in the proposition I exist, and say that representation, the I, is a mere thinking. And that would correspond directly and exactly to what he writes in the B 422-23 footnote when he says, well, if I say I exist as an empirical representation, don't get me wrong, I don't mean that the I is an empirical representation. Well, the I is just a thinking, not an intuiting. However, the whole thing is partly based on sensibility. So I think that is a possible, this representation, I mean, actually this reading is even more literal because the I is a representation. The awareness I'm consciousness is not a representation. So I think it's even more plausible that the term this representation refers solely to the I. And then the last, instead of interpreting the last quote as saying that self-intuition is required only for determining my existence, I think it's also possible to distinguish two distinct kinds of self-intuition. There is determinate self-intuition, and that is required for determining my existence, but that means, that doesn't exclude that some other kind of indeterminate intuition is needed for an awareness of that existence itself. And on that reading, we have avoided the contradiction because claim one is now compatible, as I've already said, with weak independence. So the pure representation I can only take place within a sense. And the second quote really corresponds to a certain qualification which we find in the B 422-23 footnote, and this qualification now is the following. The I think expresses an indeterminate empirical intuition. That is a perception, hence it proves that sensation, which consequently belongs to sensibility, grounds this existential proposition, but it precedes the experience that is to determine the object of perception through the category in regard to time. And here existence is not yet a category which is not related to an indeterminately given object, but rather to an object of which one has a concept and about which one wants to know whether or not it is posited outside this concept. An indeterminate perception here signifies only something real which was given, and indeed only to thinking in general, thus not as appearance and not as a thing in itself, but rather as something that in fact exists and is indicated as an existing thing in the proposition I think. So here the distinction between determinacy and indeterminacy plays a great role. Not only it plays a role on two levels, on the level of conceptual representation and on the level of sensible intuition. So there are determinate sensible intuitions that we need in order for to find out whether a certain determinate concept is such that something real corresponds to it. But then there's also indeterminate empirical intuition, which seems to suffice in order to find out whether something which we refer to by a totally indeterminate conceptual representation exists or not. And that seems to be the case in the case of the proposition I think or I exist. Why? Well, because referring by the first person pronoun I does not presuppose a determinate perception of something that fulfills a certain description. The representation I is wholly empty with respect to its content, not even a concept at all, but only a designation, Bezeichnung, of the object of inner sense, insofar as we do not further cognize it through any predicates. And then in the metaphysical foundations, he says, the I, the common correlate of apperception and itself a mere thought, designates as a pronoun a thing of indeterminate meaning, that is a subject of all predicates without any condition which would distinguish this representation from that of a something in general. So the referential mechanism of the first person pronoun I is not that we think a lot of content in the I and then find out whether some object that is given to us in experience corresponds to it. It's totally empty. It's a designation. It's a demonstrative, so to speak, in this sense. It doesn't have any content, and it refers. So it suffices that something whatsoever, some totally indeterminate thing, is given to us in order to apply it. And that seems to be compatible with then this idea that we don't need a determinate intuition in order for the awareness of our own existence. So I think the master argument pretty much holds. I think all three premises are, given the overall textual evidence, very plausible, and we should accept it. Now, we have seen that the reason why people didn't accept this is not solely that they haven't read the text carefully enough, but that they think that it's for some reason would be absurd to ascribe to Kant the idea that we need inner sense for a certain kind of, for certain mental activity, for our awareness of certain of our own mental states, namely our own spontaneous activities. And we have seen that the problems were that this model seems to involve that we have a perceptual awareness that we perceive our own mental activity, and that seems wrong because our thoughts don't look a certain way. And the second problem was that this perceptual model seems to involve a certain alienation that is not a correct description of the relation we have to our own spontaneous thinking. So can we avoid these two problems? I think we can. And I think we need a different model of how inner sense works. And I'll adapt it to a paper by Friederike Schmetz on Kant's conception of inner sense, self-affection by the understanding here. And so Schmetz says that normally when people talk about inner sense in Kant, they seem to have what she calls a meta-representational model in mind. The idea is that inner sense really functions very analogous to outer sense. Outer sense represents outer object as being in space, and it implies sensation that originate from an affection by outer objects. Now, the meta-representational model would assume that a second affection takes place, which presents us again with new sensations, and that results in a meta-representation of these first representational states. So you have meta-representations of the first representations, and you represent these first representations in time. So the problem Schmidt deals with mostly in her paper is that it is hard to see how outer objects on such a model can be represented in time at all. A second problem is that this model seems to involve a new kind of sensations. You need sensations for these meta-representations. And there's no evidence at all that somehow Kant thought that there's this additional layer of sensations on this meta-representational level. So Schmidt says we should give up that model. If we look carefully to the way Kant describes inner sense, we see that in fact inner sense works very differently. So outer sense we can take as functioning like in the first model, but now what is inner sense? So Schmidt says that inner sense is a term for the fact that our mental life can be affected from inside. So our mental life, our mind can be affected from outside. That's outer sense, but it can also be affected, causally influenced from inside. However, the causal influence from inside is not that somehow some mental states lie around there and affect us and then produce meta-representation. The order is exactly the other way around. The understanding affects the material that already lies around in our mind, so to speak. So we get the sensations through outer sense. Then, as we know from Kant's famous theory of sensible synthesis, we need to perform an activity of synthetic activity by which we combine those sensations into a manifold. That's a causal influence from inside, from the understanding. And that causal influence from the understanding, that affection from inside, leads, this form of sensible synthesis, leads to an awareness of that manifold of sensations as such. That's the story. And inner sense just means that we are receptive to that affection from inside, and the inside is the understanding. So inner sense is a passive capacity, and we need that passive capacity on the other side of the active capacity that we have when our understanding works or operates on our sensibility. So our sensibility needs to be such that it can be affected by such an activity of the understanding. That's all Schmidt says about inner sense and affection. That's all Kant means. So that means that no meta-representation is involved. And it is also immediately clear that we don't get this problem that outer sense isn't in time, because outer sense, the sensations that operate in inner sense are exactly those sensations that come from outer sense. So it is clear that this also, the outer objects that eventually are the result. Pardon? The outer objects that we are aware of through that maneuver are in time. Now, how does that help us? I mean, Schmidt talks about sensible awareness, awareness of sensible stuff, of our sensations, outer sensations, inner sensations. Our problem case is the awareness of our own intellectual activity, of our own reasoning and thinking. So how does this model help us to explain inner sense, the role of inner sense in the awareness of our own thinking? And I'm proposing to look at two passages, or there are also other related passages, but two passages where Kant speaks about the relation between inner sense and attention. So here he writes in B 246, he says, I do not see how one can find so many difficulties in the fact that inner sense is affected by ourselves. So here's self-affection. Every act of attention can give us an example of this. In such acts, the understanding always determines the inner sense. How much the mind is affected by this means everybody will be able to perceive in himself. And then in the progress essay, he writes, for every inner psychological observation that we undertake, we are required to affect inner sense by means of attention. For thoughts as factual determinations of the power of representation also belong to the empirical representation of our state. So the idea is that in order to self-ascribe, to become explicitly aware of our own mental activities, of our own thoughts as factual determinations of us, as belonging to us, we need an additional act, namely attention. We need to attend to our own thinking. And that attention makes these thoughts conscious to us. Otherwise, we might think them without being conscious of them, but when we direct our attention to them, we become conscious of them as such. And that's a case of causal influence. Attention is a way of affecting, just as sensible synthesis is a way of affecting. So inner sense is required for self-consciousness of our thinking and reasoning in the minimal sense that we need to attend to this thinking and reasoning in order to become aware of it, and in the sense that this attending is a causal influence that we exert onto ourselves and for which we hence have to be receptive, passive, and which turns those thoughts and reasoning into appearances with a temporal duration. So by attending, we turn those thoughts suddenly are not just thinking, which is purely directed to the thought of object, but those thoughts now suddenly appear to us as something happening in time. They appear to us as something having, as when we attend to our thinking, we experience it as something that has a beginning and an end. So time comes in through that attention. And so I propose that when Kant speaks about this indeterminate empirical intuition that he mentions in the B422 footnote, he means the effect of that affection by the attention. And it is clear that in the Prolegomena, he calls this indeterminate empirical intuition nothing more than a feeling of an existence and only a representation of that to which all thinking stands in relation. So because it's a case of affection, affection always has as a result, as in this case, a certain feeling. So we feel our being acted upon, and that is the indeterminate empirical intuition, which allows us then to infer or to be aware of something actual, to be aware of something existent. So we have solved some of the problem of non-perceivability because the attention model of inner sense does not imply that thoughts are perceivable or have a certain look or it feels a certain way to see them. And it also, I think, explains non-alienation, because if you think of it, what am I conscious of? What is the affecting thing? Is it something lying around and being outside me from which I'm alienated? No, the affecting thing in attention is myself. I'm attending to myself. The attending is itself a spontaneous activity, so I'm precisely essentially aware. So the idea is, in the thought I'm thinking that P, the I is a mere conceptual representation. The I represents me as, or represents the active, the spontaneous part. But then the awareness that corresponds to that relates this I to something real, is again, it's an affecting thing, but it's an affecting thing that is me. It's a spontaneously affecting thing. So it's somehow the I corresponds to something that of which I'm aware, which is spontaneous. And that explains, I think, that this awareness of attention as a mode of being aware of your own thinking isn't a form of alienation. Okay, that was it. I hope you have a lot of questions, and I'm assuming that you have a lot of objections and questions. Thank you so much for your patience.